Bet daktarė maloniai palengvino mums darbą vieną vertimą.
But Dr. Giovanelli was kind enough to save us one translation.
Ir kalbės angliškai.
And she will be speaking in English.
Galėčiau tik tai pridurti, ji, kiek žinau, pranešime pati trupučiuką savo gyvenimo istoriją paminė.
As far as I know, she mentioned some of her life story in the presentation.
Tiesiog norėčiau atkreipti dėmesį visų, turbūt visi ir pastebėjome, iš Vatikano moteris.
But I would still like to draw everyone's attention, as I'm sure everyone must have already noticed, that we have here with us a lady from the Vatican.
Ir dar galėčiau pridurti, kad iki visai dar šią vasarą Flaminija buvo viena iš turbūt beveik aukščiausias pareigas turinti Vatikano moteris.
And up until this summer, Flaminia was the highest ranking lady in the Vatican. She held the highest position that any woman held in Vatican.
Ji buvo integralios žmogaus raidos dikasterijos pasekretorė.
She was the sub-secretary of the Undersecretary of the Dicastery of Integral Human Development, something like that.
Tai, kaip žinome, Vatikano pareigybės yra trupučiuką kitokios nei mūsų valstybėse.
And as we know, the titles in Vatican sound slightly different than in our own states.
Ir galbūt ji pati galėtų pasakyti, kas yra dikasterija.
And maybe she would be so kind as to explain what's a dicastery.
Ir su tais juokais ir perduodu jai žodį.
And on this fun, and with these jokes, I will pass it on to you.
Tiesa, dar noriu vieną klausimą. Ar yra žmonių, kurie nesupranta angliškai? Jeigu tokių yra, pakelkite rankas. Jei ne, tai mes tada diskusijos neverstume į lietuvių anglų kalbą, mes galėtumėm tiesiog diskutuoti angliškai.
Arba jeigu kam nors reikia užduoti klausimą ir jūs tik tai negalite suformuluoti, tada aš galiu išversti tik į anglų, bet ne iš anglų.
Gerai taip?
Ne?
Sutarėm?
Visiems tinka, ne?
Nėra paskutinis perspėjimas. Pakelkit rankas, kas protestuojate, po to daugiau nebebus viskas sutarta. Ačiū.
We're just discussing interpreting. It's fine.
Does it work? Yeah. Thank you. Well, good morning, and thank you, first of all, to the organizers for inviting me in such. Thank you. In such a beautiful place and in such beautiful days. I don't know if I have to satisfy your curiosity about the dicastery, but I will start with that. The dicastery, I have been serving at the Holy See during many years, 43 years, and during 42 I was serving at the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, which is also a dicastery. But then, with the reform, there has been a merging in between 4 different pontifical councils, and so as they didn't know how to call us, they called us dicastery, which is very general and it means a kind of ministry, only that. But in the Vatican there are congregations and councils, and the congregations are the more important and the older offices of the Vatican. Then I can explain something else if you are interested in that more formal or bureaucratic, the Vatican bureaucracy. even if we are not a bureaucracy, but the structure is a bureaucratic one. So I will start with my presentation, and I am happy I had to finish it some days before so that you could translate it and Gabriella can have a little rest. That's in any case, I will really, I would like to express my gratitude for this invitation to this conference, which seems to be such a kind of an experiment, or at least it is the first forum, if I am right. And as I already, we have had the occasion to speak about it, I discovered a lot of connection, and this is what gave me really a joy to participate. The first one is the fact that we are here nearby the Thomas Mann summer house in Nida. And this brought me to think to another little town located in Italy, nearby Rome, 36 kilometers from Rome, where a young Thomas Mann spent a very fruitful time, and where I used to spend a big part of the year, and I still do so. This little town is called Palestrina. It's a very ancient town, more ancient than Rome, very, very old town. But in that town, the Heinrich Mann, the brother of Thomas Mann, spent more than a year, and he wrote, we imagine what in Italian is called a book, the Piccola città, the small town. And Thomas Mann spent a summer in 1897, right in the little town. Many years later, in 1947, he set a scene of the encounter between the protagonist of his Dr. Faustus, the musician Leverkusen, and the demon. And in the book, Dr. Faustus, there are pages about this this encounter that are really, you can see the people of Palestrina, of this little town, you can recognize them one by one. It's very funny. Another connection which certainly determined the choice of the theme of our conference is the interest of Thomas Mann in Europe, considered as a cultural unity. This interest is witnessed by the many warnings to Europe that he thought to be the only antidote to German nationalism, and particularly by two famous discourses addressed to young people. There are so many young people here today, it's another good connection, pronounced just in the years in which Nida hosted him during the summer. And talking about Europe, I cannot but remember my European youth. This is another important connection that concerns me personally. In fact, I belong to the first generation of new Europeans, if I can say, as I lived in Brussels between 1958 and 1965, which sounds very, very back in the history of Europe. My father was a pioneer of the European construction, and myself and my classmates of only 6 different nationalities were pioneers of the Brussels European School. At that time, Europe was not a migraine, and we were curious to discover the culture, the languages, and the different ways of life of our fellow students, enjoying, maybe unconsciously, the atmosphere created by the ideas of the founding fathers of the European community. I could also tell another story, but this is for after. Finally, a more important connection has to do with the very argument of my presentation. That is to say, the connection between Europe and the Catholic Church that I had the privilege and the joy to serve during 43 years. This bond has always been very strong during the 20th century, throughout which the popes, starting from Benedict XV during World War I, have always acted to bring peace in the continent. In particular, after World War II, they manifested in different ways their convinced and strong Europeanism. This deep interest in Europe and in European peoples can be identified in three directions: the spiritual unity of Europe, the importance of the European identity, and the rich network of the Catholic Church institutions at the European level. The spiritual unity of Europe was the motivation that prompted Blessed Paul VI, he will be a saint in a few days, to proclaim Saint Benedict, already greeted by Pius XII, Father of Europe, Patron of Europe. The proclamation occurred in October 1964, and at that very circumstance, Pope Paul wished that for men today, those who can act and those who can only desire, the ideal of the spiritual unity of Europe be intangible and sacred, and that they didn't miss a help from above to realize it in a practical and opportune order. The help from above is the one of Saint Benedict, of course. The position of St. John Paul II on this question was even more resolute due to his origins of man of the East. His insistence on the argument and the imaged way in which he put it are well known. Very often, he spoke about the necessity of Europe to breathe with both lungs, and in one of his major discourses on the theme, addressing the European Parliament in 1988, when the European community gathered 12 countries, he said, "Other nations will certainly be able to join those that are represented here today. As the Supreme Pastor of the Universal Church, myself a native of Eastern Europe, and knowing the aspirations of the Slavic peoples, the other lung of our common European homeland, my wish is that Europe, willingly giving itself free institutions, may one day reach the full dimensions that geography and, even more, history have given it." A year later, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the wish of St. John Paul were granted. The second direction is the importance of the European identity. I should better say, the importance of the awareness of the European identity and the need to proclaim it openly. In short, this is the question of the Christian roots and the wished reference to them in the European Constitution that was abandoned. This demand didn't and doesn't come only from the Catholic Church. It was and is shared by a number of secular intellectuals and, in a more or less conscious way, by a large part of the European people. In fact, the debate around the inclusion of a reference to the Christian roots, besides the Greek Enlightenment tradition already adopted, gave rise to a debate that has been defined absurd. Not recognizing the Christian roots of Europe implies the repudiation of Christianity's public role, the exclusion of the engagement with Europe's religious tradition, which is so clear despite its denominational variations, and ultimately it constitutes a threat to democracy itself, whose strengths depend on the values that it promotes. In final analysis, the choice to oppose or ignore the European Christian tradition, rather than to dialogue with it, could be judged a sign of immaturity, if not indeed weakness. I am personally afraid that this weakness, if it is not the only cause of the present European crisis concerning the migration phenomenon, is at least one of those that originated it. Finally, the third direction in which we can detect the tight connection in between the Catholic Church and Europe is the network of church institutions, official or spontaneous, centered in the religious or socio-political issues of the continent. Its aim is to keep formally and concretely alive the link between the Church on one side and the European nations and institutions on the other. I will just point out the major ones. At the ecclesial level, the largest institution is the Council of the European Conferences of Europe, which embraces the representatives of 45 countries. In between the other aims, the Council has also the one of the ecumenical collaboration for the unity of Christians, giving a living ecclesial witness in European society. I have willingly recalled this institution because it was born thanks to the vision and the foresight of Cardinal Roger Echegaray, who has been my boss for many years, a very important man. And the European treaties do not envision the participation of the churches as observers, as it is the case for the Council of Europe, where the Holy See develops in this quality a very intense activity from 1970. It is only in 1980, the year after the first European elections, that the bishops of the then 8 European member states of the European Economic Community created the Comece, with the aim to communicating to the European institutions and authorities the opinions and the views of the European bishops of the member states concerning European integration. Now they're the representative of 25 different countries. It should be noted that the diplomatic relationships between the Holy See and the European Economic Community were established since 1970, another signal of the importance given by the Church to the European construction. Besides these more official institutions, there are other more spontaneous. I will point out only one because I have been very familiar with it during many years, the Conference of the European Justice and Peace Commissions. There is also a commission in Lithuania. Well, now the first step was just the aim of my speech, of my presentation is to propose a cure or a contribution to a cure to this migraine. The first step to cure any disease is to describe the symptoms, which in Europe are more or less evident. We have them before us and we all know them. Nevertheless, I will try to point out some because this is the first stage of the process of discernment offered by what we call the social teaching of the Church. And that has been my work during so many years. A process with which I'm familiar and that contemplates 3 consecutive stages: see, judge, and act. Before going to the first stage, the one to see, I think that 2 premises are necessary. All our world is today dominated by the phenomenon of globalization. So I think that our headache is largely due to this phenomenon, which, in the words of St. John Paul II, a priori is neither good nor bad. It will be what people make of it. The second premise, I dare to say that Europe is a migraine in itself, starting with the very difficulty of trying to define it. Pope Benedict XVI, who is a profound scholar of the issue of the European identity, answers this way to the question about what is Europe. Europe is not a continent that can be comprehended neatly in geographical terms. Rather, it is a cultural and historical concept. Europe, in Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger thinking, constitutes for its citizens a way of being together by different people that is founded not on a mutual ordering of faith and reason. It is not possible to overstress the importance of this combination with faith and reason. In Pope Benedict's view, the positivist approach to nature and reason is the most important dimension of human knowledge. But in and of itself, it is insufficient to correspond to the full breadth of the human condition, and particularly cannot fully express the case of Europe, which became Europe through the Christian faith, which carries the heritage of Israel in itself, but at the same time has absorbed the best of the Greek and Roman spirit into itself. To live up to the richness of this cultural heritage cannot but give one a headache. Coming back to the symptoms, I just a few flashes. It is not necessary to look at Eurostat complicated website. I tried to do that, it was really difficult, to notice the aging crisis of our population decline in Europe. It's enough to thinking to our present families and to consider some amazing news. Germany misses midwives and teachers, which seems to be very amazing. But if I think at the family, my mother's family, there were 8 brothers and sisters, and today we are 16 cousins. The high majority is not married, or we don't have children. So this is what made Pope Francis say, Europe, which is now a grandmother, no longer fertile and vibrant. In fact, if the Europeans were 738 million in 2015, forecasts showed that we will be, or they will be, considering my age, 734 million in 2030 and 707 million in 2050. I will not make the comparison with Africa, which would be really a big difference. Second symptom, the rise of economic inequalities inside the European countries and between the member states and the European Union is another symptom. This is particularly alarming, considering that in the Treaty of Lisbon we read that the European Union shall work for the sustainable development of Europe based on balanced economic growth and price stability, a highly competitive social market economy, and shall combat social exclusion and discrimination, promote social justice and protection, equality between women and men, solidarity between generations, and protection of rights of the child. Taking into account only the differences in wages, it is clear that Europe has found it quite difficult to realize its objectives. Recent data show that the top 20% of Europeans earn 5 times more than the bottom 20%. It is not surprising then that the European workers, in particular the young, move constantly from one country to another to find a better remuneration, if not simply to find a job. To say nothing about the children at risk of poverty. There are 1 million more than 10 years ago. The appointment last January of a Minister of Loneliness in the United Kingdom seems to me to be another unmistakable symptom of our migraine. Isn't this an important indicator of a diffuse social malaise? 14% of the population in Great Britain often or always feels alone, with economic consequences, as it seems to cost the United Kingdom employers up to the 5 billion annually of sterling. This is the sad reality of modern life. This is the word of Theresa May in creating this ministry. Sad reality of modern life, and it doesn't affect only Europe. If, for instance, a third of American citizens over the age of 40 feel lonely. Nevertheless, it is particularly shocking in Europe, where the density of population is still quite high, and where the culture is a relational one, facilitated by a network of many towns of little and medium size, where the exchanges between inhabitants are customary or were customary. The last symptom I will point out is very similar to the previous one, but more complex. This is the feeling of fear that is going through Europe. In fact, the terrorist attacks suffered by many of our European countries. The terrorist threat present all over the continent. The Industrial Revolution 4.0 and the expected transformation in the world of work with job losses that will inevitably follow. The sensation of an increase of crime amplified by the media. In my country, in Italy, the news report that at least one woman is killed each day. The deterioration of infrastructures, you don't know Italy, Lithuania, you are lucky, but in many countries, particularly in Italy, they are really evident. After the falling down of the Morandi Bridge in Genoa, all the Italians are afraid to pass over any bridge and under any gallery, I can assure you. The well-known migration crisis. These are all some of the causes that seem to justify the feeling of fear. The problem is that all this has moved into a considerable part of the European electorate and towards the defense rhetoric and fear appeal, which begins to dangerously resonate. Finally, I am not in measure to know the reasons for Brexit, but it is clear enough that this event cannot but be considered a major, if not the major symptom of the Europe-triggered migraine. The second stage of the discernment process is the judgment of the situation. In this case, to try to understand what is at the origin of the symptoms. It will, of course, be a very quick overview, perhaps unsatisfactory or non-exhaustive, certainly unsatisfactory, but anyway. Nevertheless, the particular perspective from which I look at the issue will hopefully bring some elements to understand the illness. It is impossible to name only one cause for the origin of the population decline. After all, as usual, the causes are more than one. Anyhow, I would synthesize saying that in Europe we are experiencing a widespread existential fragmentation accompanied by a kind of a fear for the future, The situation concerns all sectors of society, but it is particularly relevant in regard to the family, where human beings are generated, at least where they used to be generated. And there is no doubt that Europe is presently witnessing the grave phenomenon of family crisis and weakening of the very concept of family. This weakening, pointed out by St. John Paul II in 2003, couldn't be successfully counteracted over these years, despite the fact that young people, in Italy 70%, still consider the family a pillar of their life. A large majority of them, in Italy 94%, are in favor of funding a family with children, and that many of them, 40% in Italy, would like to have more than 2 children. The statistics I quoted are about Italy because I was not able to read it in Lithuanian, of course. The issue of the family is crucial for the Catholic Church, as it is demonstrated also by the 2 synods for family held at the Vatican in 2014 and 2015, 30 years after the first one held in 1980. So, in 2015, a few years ago, the bishops couldn't but observe a growing and extreme individualism that weakens family bonds and ends up considering each member of the family as an isolated unit. But on the other hand, the bishops also noticed the difficulties of the families coming from abroad. They, the families, feel abandoned due to a lack of interest and attention on the part of institutions. The negative impact of on the social order is clear, as seen in the demographic crisis, in the difficulties of raising children, in a hesitancy to welcome new life. Passing to the second symptom, there is no need to insist on the potential explosive consequences that the growing of inequalities can produce. It may be difficult to say a definitive last word on such a complicated issue, studied at the scientific level by many scholars all over the world. However, it is undeniable that this particular situation has to do also, if not primarily, with the moral sphere. In fact, a progressive splitting up between the financial activities and the actual economy, world production, and the predatory and speculative tendencies became more and more evident with the last financial and economic crisis. In this situation, if there is an agreement on the need of more international regulations, it appears clearly that the economy, like every other sphere of human action, needs ethics in order to function correctly. And I will add, not any ethics, but an ethics which is people-centered. Otherwise, money will rule and not serve. The point is that the current vision of the human person is limited, as the person is understood individualistically and predominantly as a consumer, whose profit consists above all in the optimization of his or her monetary income. But actually, the human person is characterized essentially by a rationality that resists a reductionist view of one's basic needs. Thus, in the transmission of goods among persons, there is always something more than mere material goods at play, as for instance, trust and equity. This is something that touches the moral sphere. In our globalized world, these considerations could be valid all over, but they are particularly relevant in Europe because our traditions, also in economy, were quite different. We used to talk about social market economy, or civil economy in Italy, or cooperatives, etc. This is another tradition, not a pure capitalistic one. As for the third signal of migraine, the diffuse sense of malaise, I would like to point out a major cause that seems to me to be at its roots. As many of our contemporaries, the European men and women give the impression to be themselves the only measure of life. This could appear to be an achievement, but in the end, it is unsatisfactory. Many reasons contribute to the sense that human beings are suffering from narcissism, and so often are inclined to depression. 70% of the European population suffers from this disease that accounts for 20% in the European Union countries. I would like to mention just two expressions of this malaise. The first one is the strong power received from the new technologies, so diffused in Europe, for which advances we have to rejoice, but contemporary man has not been trained to use power well. And he forgets that we are not God. Those are words of a quotation of the last social encyclical of Pope Francis, and the first one of the famous theologian Romano Guardini. The second one is the exasperation of the culture of rights. Of course, we Europeans must be proud of our legal culture born, or better said, reborn after World War II. But we must agree that it has placed the human being at the center in an exaggerated way, in the sense that every desire is becoming now a right. Slowly, in our secularized world, it has changed him into a totally self-reliant individual who doesn't correspond to the very nature of human being. Finally, I would like to consider the feeling of fear that many Europeans perceive. This has to do, in my opinion, with the loss of historical consciousness found in many European countries, and thus with the fear of losing our European identity. This issue of the historical consciousness, which in Europe is very complex because of the complexity that we have inherited from our past, is even more complicated by a paradox that we can observe in our continent. In fact, in Europe, we find some nations suffering from an excess of memory and others from a voluntary lack of memory. In both cases, it is about a degenerated relationship with the tradition. This has consequences not only in the capacity to look towards the future, but also in the responsibility to take charge of the present. And ultimately, it has as a consequence the fear to lose our cultural identity. This is why, from his perspective, St. John Paul II talked about a loss of Europe's Christian memory and heritage, accompanied by a kind of practical agnosticism and religious indifference, adding that many Europeans give the impression of living without spiritual roots and somewhat like heirs who have squandered a patrimony entrusted to them by history. With even more vibrant and, in a sense, pessimistic expressions, Pope Benedict talked about a strange form of self-hate of Europe and the West, that, in his word, we can only consider pathological. In order to survive, said Pope Benedict, visiting the Italian Senate, Europe needs a new, critical and humble acceptance of itself. Now we arrived at the final stage of our discernment progress action. I have made, from the very beginning of my presentation, quite a number of references to what we call pontifical magisterium, so the discourses and the documents of the Pope. For this last section, I will follow particularly, if not exclusively, the discourse that Pope Francis addressed to the participants to the conference on the theme Rethinking Europe, a Christian contribution to the future of the European project, sponsored by the Commission of Bishops' Conferences of the European Community. The reason is evident, the title of the meeting. Nevertheless, before moving on the proposal of Pope Francis, some premises are needed. Facing the present uncertainties and a growing sense of nationalism in various countries, in Italy, part of the press used to speak of souveranism originated by people experiencing dissatisfaction vis-à-vis the European institutions. We must reaffirm the principle that today, at present, the national state is that nowadays the principle of the national state is inadequate to found a new order of peace. A second premise, daring to speak about the contribution of Catholic Church, better say the Christian contribution, facing a totally secularized European society seems unrealistic. But scholars have clearly affirmed that, contrary of the common opinion, secularization is not the last word of history, is not an irreversible process. We should perhaps talk about a situation synthesized by the expression, this is from an Italian sociologist, the force of religion and the weakness of faith. That is to say, to the strength of religion as a need for sacredness corresponds the crisis of faith. Moreover, I think it is good to reaffirm that the Christian contribution does not represent a threat to the secularity of states or to the independence of the institutions of the European Union, but it rather intends to be an enrichment. In fact, the positive and constructive role that religion in general plays in the building up of society open to dialogue should be considered. In my final premise, I would like to point out that, considering the motto of the European Union, united in diversity, where unity does not mean uniformity of political, economic, and cultural life or ways of thinking, the Catholic Church in Europe can give a sort of a model. That unity between the local churches in Europe, without denying the differences derived from historical situations and events, links the various parts of Europe. It is a unity which, rooted in a common Christian inspiration, is capable of reconciling diverse cultural traditions and which demands, at the level of both society and church, a constant growth in mutual knowledge open to an increased sharing of individual values. Let's move now to the concrete indication given by Pope Francis almost 1 year ago to bring about the Christian responsibility towards Europe. Consistent with his thought and personality, Pope Francis thinks that Christians have to remind Europe that she is not a mass of statistics or institutions, but is made up of people. Issues must not be reduced to discussions about numbers. This is because of the honor due to the human dignity, to the centrality of the human person created by God in His image, which, along with his or her rights, is also the main point of reference for the European construction. We must recognize that we often have the impression, speaking about European matters, that there are no citizens, only votes, no migrants, only quotas, no workers, only economic markers, no poor, only threshold of poverty. Second, thanks to the fact that Christians recognize that their identity is primarily relational, also because they are joined to one another as members of one body, the Church, a second contribution that they can make to the future of Europe is to help recover the sense of belonging to a community. After all, the founding fathers choose this very word to identify the new political subject, European community. Christians have also the task to reaffirm that the primordial community remains the family, as the most fundamental place for the process of discovery of personal identity. In the family, diversity is valued and at the same time brought into unity. Analogously, this relationship is also found in civil society, with which Christians, assured in their identity, knowing who they are ready to collaborate. Thinking of the service-minded attitude of the founding fathers, inspired also by their faith, Christians are called to promote political dialogue and to restore dignity to politics. No need to say how much dialogue is needed in politics today. All too often, we see how politics are becoming a forum for clashes between opposing forces. The voice of dialogue is replaced by shouted claims and demands, at least in Italy. One as often has the feeling that the primary goal is no longer the common good, and this perception is shared by more and more citizens. Extremist and populist groups are finding fertile ground in many countries. They make protest the heart of their political message. They make protest the heart of their political message without offering the alternative of a constructive political project. Another domain where Christians can offer their contribution is the promotion of a Europe that is an inclusive community. This is a difficult task today with the migration issue, when the migration issue has become the main argument for political confrontation. If all government authorities have the duty to address the question with the virtue proper to governance, which is prudence, keeping in mind the need for an open heart without erecting walls of indifference and fear, Christians, for their part, following the guidance received by Jesus' words, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me," have to collaborate with the civil authority to govern this epochal phenomenon, welcoming, protecting, promoting, and integrating the migrants and refugees. Finally, I would like to mention the major contribution of the Catholic Church to the European construction. It's social teaching. It's because it has been my task during so many years. In fact, this teaching had more than some influence at the very beginning of the process of European unity due to the formation and religious conviction of our founding fathers. Still, the social teaching, a whole of principle of reflection, norms of judgment, and directive for action, can be an inspiration for European policies also in our time. After all, the principle of subsidiarity laid down in the Treaty of European Union is clearly borrowed from the Catholic social teaching. Even more so, when Pope Francis talked about bricks needed to build the European structure as solidarity, development, and peace, his point of reference is the social teaching. He has in mind that solidarity, lifeblood of a mature community, and the other face of the matter of subsidiarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, to the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. Talking about development, when Pope Francis says that a Europe that rediscovers itself as a community will surely be a source of development for herself and for the whole world, he certainly wanted to make a link with the Treaty of the European Union. In fact, the preamble of the Treaty of Lisbon recognizes the determination of the European Union to promote economic and social progress, taking into account the principle of sustainable development and within the context of the accomplishment of the international market and of reinforced cohesion and environmental protection. But Pope Francis surely thinks about the concept of development presented by Blessed Paul VI in 1967 and still valid today. Development, we read in Populorum Progressio, which is the new name for peace. To be authentic must be well-rounded, integral we should say today. It must foster the development of each man and of the whole man. When Pope Francis calls for a commitment of Christians in Europe to represent a promise of peace, he reminds all of us that peace has not to be taken for granted, and clearly make reference to the central concern that inspired the signatories of the Treaties of Rome after two world wars, an atrocious act of violence perpetrated by peoples against peoples. But not only. He certainly also considered the profound teaching of St. John XXIII in Pace Terris, that put as any condition to a lasting peace the recognition that each individual man or woman is truly a person. He is a nature that is endowed with intelligence and free will. As such, he has rights and duties, which together flow as a direct consequence from his nature. These rights and duties are universal and inviolable, and therefore altogether inalienable. Isn't this conviction at the very foundation of the European Union? And I would like to add, isn't this the conviction that pushed so many human beings, migrants and refugees, to come to Europe to see their right recognized? In conclusion, Pope Francis liked concreteness. It is well known. But he is also capable of visionary thoughts, in particular when he has to give hope to youth, in this case to European youth. With mind and heart, with hope and without vain nostalgia, like a son who rediscovered in Mother Europe his roots of life and faith, I dream of a new European humanism, one that involves a constant work of humanization and calls for the memory, courage, and sound and human utopian vision. I dream of a Europe that is young, still capable of being a mother who has life because she respects life and offers hope for life. Let's put then a bit of sound utopianism in our medicine to cure Europe-triggered migraine. So thank you for your attention for such a long speech.
Aš vis dėlto rizikuosiu kalbėti lietuviškai, taip angliškai viską suprantu, galiu siekti, bet...
I would prefer to speak in Lithuanian. I can follow it in English, but not talk.
Labai ačiū Flaminijai už man labai brangų pranešimą.
Thank you so much, Flaminia, for the presentation that was very dear to me.
Kada, Lina, mes turim iš čia išeiti, kad nevėluotumėm į pietus? Gerai, tai dar turim maždaug 15 minučių pasvarstymams ir kalbėjimams. Aš tikiuosi, kad minčių ir klausimų turite ir jūs.
We have approximately 15 more minutes before we need to leave for lunch. I hope that you too have questions and observations to contribute.
Aš pats už tai pasinaudosiu savo privilegiją ir užduosiu patį pirmą klausimą, o paskui kalbėkimės.
I'm going to take advantage of my position and ask the first question, and after that, let's all join in and continue.
Man tikrai labai patinka šis pranešimas, bet mes čia, sakykime, mūsų regionuose jaučiame ir kalbame, ką tik šiandien su profesorium Šlechta pradėjom kalbėti apie bažnyčią ir pradėjome sakyti, o tai kurią Lenkijos bažnyčią?
I really enjoyed the presentation, but the conversation that we're having, let's say, in this region is kind of similar to what we talked about with Professor Schlachter this morning, that as soon as you mentioned the church, the Catholic Church, one immediately must ask, so which one of the Polish Catholic churches do you really mean?
Lietuvoje dar niekas neklausė, apie kurią katalikų bažnyčią kalbame.
In Lithuania, we don't yet ask which Lithuanian Catholic Church do you mean.
Bet mes tikrai jaučiame irgi didelę vidinę bažnyčioje įtampą.
But we also feel a really strong tension within the church, inside the church. Locally.
Ir manau, kad tai tampa ir būtent susijusi su visais tais klausimais, apie kuriuos mes čia šiandien kalbame.
And I do believe that this tension is related to all of the questions that you mentioned here.
Kaip matyti iš Vatikano? Ar pirma, tikras klausimas, ar išlaikys bažnyčia vienybę?
So what does it look like if you look from the Vatican? The first real question is, will the church keep the unity? Will it not split?
Ir antrasis klausimas, ar tos tendencijos čia yra, sakykime, mūsų regiono, ar čia yra, kaip atrodo visuotinės bažnyčios akimis?
And the second question is, do these trends emerge only locally, only within our own region, or can you see something like that in the whole of the church in all the world?
Well, of course, seen from the center, it's difficult to say. Well, we have this perspective that we are in really a turmoil, a difficulty. That's a very difficult period for many reasons. But I must say that you give me the help mentioning the whole church, because I can mention my recent experience in Africa.
Yes.
And I visited not Mozambique, but I was in Mozambique a month ago, and this is a place where I go quite regularly. I go once a year. This time I wasn't there in 2 years, and I could see the society or the issue of the politics, etc., worsening, in the sense that everybody was talking about corruption and a lot of difficulties, of course, of the countries and the development which is slow, etc. But still, there is changes. But I could see, I could observe a church, a lively church. And I was really very happy to see that. They are building bigger churches because the people don't fit inside. But this is not only a question of number. This is a church more aware of the responsibility of the Catholic we say, because I'm talking about the Catholic Church, the responsibility of the Catholic towards the common good and towards the society. It was absolutely absent 2 years ago. I saw a very encouraging change in the responsibility of the church. They don't talk about this because maybe they don't have origins, the deep roots of Christian roots. They don't have this kind of discussions. But of course, this is that's a difficult time that in general, that particularly in Europe and in Western and in the West, we are experiencing. And I think that this is not probably this is being side by side with the clergy for so many years. I take the same solution. They say we have to pray, but really we have to pray for that, for the unity. This is not only because that's an easy way to find an answer, but this is really, I think that we really need to pray for the unity of the church.
Ačiū. Ačiū. Dabar turite klausimų, kas nors, aš vis tiek manau, kad čia.
Thank you.
Porose.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Giovanelli, for your broad perspective on, I think, really important topic. And I think my question follows from your few premises that you mentioned. The one is that European basis is the Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome, and the premise that culture and historical background is the basis for the Europe. But I think one of the reasons of the migraine and one of the reasons of anxiety that Europeans face is the changes in that basis, and especially looking from the migration perspective that you mentioned. And one of the, I think, things you willfully or not avoided is the question of Islam culture and Muslim communities. So, from your perspective, is it possible that Islam might become the integral part of Europe culture at some point? And if not, so what's the meaning of coexistence from the Catholic Church point of view between Muslim communities and communities that bases their point of view to the world on Christianity?
think that you are right. This is the very core question. This is why I was talking about this awareness of of our cultural identity. Well, if you know who you are, you better dialogue. We are forced to dialogue. We are forced to that, even if. But then to dialogue, you must know who you are. Otherwise, it is not a dialogue. It's just how do you say, narrative. And so this is why we have to strengthen our faith. But this question of also migrants, and it has to see with the question of integration. I must say that sometimes it's also a question of numbers. Stupid, but I read, preparing my presentation, I read a lot of some things, interviews. There was an interview with the former Italian head of government, Enrico Letta, who is a strong Europeanist. He has been, I think that he grew up in Brussels, etc. He teaches in the Sorbonne, etc. And when talking about this question of integration, I think that he pointed out an aspect. He said, well, if in the classroom of my children, there are 25% of people coming from abroad, they can integrate. If there are 55, it's impossible. So it's also a question of number, I think. We cannot avoid this. And then this is a question of how to integrate them, in the sense of how, this is also this, there's also the discussion about the multicultural or intercultural society. Pope Benedict XVI was said that multicultural, it doesn't work. So this is more intercultural. I agree with him. And so this is why we have to see how to do this integration. Of course, the integration they have, but I must say that what I said before, just at the end, I think that this look, probably the main reason of this migration in Europe is not only is the question of war and of course of poverty. This is a question of recognition, but to see the human rights. This is our system of rule of law, of human rights, etc. This is what pushes the people to come. Because why? If you see this the migration, I consider that this is a phenomenon that is all over the world. In Latin America, you find a lot of migrants, but still, the major part of migrants are coming to Europe, which is smaller, in comparing to South America or to Asia or to Africa. Also in Africa they are moving, but it's a big continent, and there are less people than in Europe. So people like to come to Europe. This is not only what we can be also part of. I would say a plan from the Muslims to conquer the Europe, probably that part, but the big part is not. I don't think it is for that, because when they come from Africa, there are some who are paid by the Arabs, etc. But this idea of complot. I don't think it is. But in any case, I wanted to say something else. Now it's gone. But about this question of integration, probably from the faith point of view, we must not abandon this idea of evangelization. I don't. This is not proselytism. It is not. But we are with this fear of being accused of proselytism. We are not. We are afraid to show our faith and also to hope that people convert. Why not? But sometimes we are afraid to say that because it is not modern, it is not, we are in a secularized society, etc. I think that from a point of view of faith, we should not abandon totally this idea of, in any case, for instance, when I talk about social teaching of the church, which has been my job for all the life, but one of the definition of the social teaching of the church is an instrument of evangelization. We must not forget it. Even as Christians, it's a way of showing that our idea of common good, which is really a particular word that it's not as easy to catch for everybody, but this is the good one, to build up civil, peaceful and just and civil society.
Thank you. Nelabai galiu daugiau leisti klausinėti. Vėl raginu visus, kuriems atskiri klausimai rūpi, eiti ir kalbėtis tarpusavyje, nes dabar jau Nida sakė, kad jau mes turime eiti pietų.
We can't really afford any more questions since we need to go and have lunch, and as before, I encourage